This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thank you for watching this week's NC Spin. We begin this week's show with the latest UNC high-level departure, this one from East Carolina. We ask whether Chancellor Staton was fired or really resigned. Next, we take on the 2020 election and reveal an early poll of presidential preferences. Then, if we have time, we want to talk about association health plans and ask if they're going to be passed in our state. But you can be sure we'll ask our panel to tell us something we don't know. Speaking of the panel, this week we welcome Deborah Ross, former legislator and former candidate for the U.S. Senate, John Hood, current syndicated columnist and author, Chris Fitzsimon, director of the Newsroom, and we also welcome Andrew Dunn, who's the publisher of Longleaf Politics. We begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
North Carolinians pay for health insurance for people in 37 other states, yet 300,000 of our citizens have no affordable health insurance options. Let's find a North Carolina solution for covering the uninsured. Visit careforcarolina.com.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
Let's get started. Since December, there's been speculation about East Carolina University's Chancellor, Cecil Staton, and rumors had him resigning his post prior to the start of the year. But nothing happened. That is, until Sunday night, when Carolina Journal announced he was resigning. But Monday's news was a bit different. In a press conference, Staton said it wasn't his choice. And one member of the Board of Governors pointed to BOG Chair Harry Smith's long-standing campaign to get rid of Staton. When Smith couldn't get the board to fire Staton, he had the UNC president, Bill Roper, strongly suggest that Staton resign. Andrew Dunn, the question everybody is asking is, which version of this is true? Did Staton, was he fired or did he resign? What do you think?
Well, look, as you referenced, there's been plenty of public statements, including from the Chancellor himself, saying that this wasn't a completely voluntary resignation. So there, I have every reason to believe that that is probably true. But when your big boss, the head of the UNC Board of Governors appears to be, wanting you out the door, there's kind of the writings on the wall. I mean, my understanding is that Bill Roper probably gave him more of a, we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. Now, in my mind,
let's sit down and reason together.
Exactly. But in my mind, that's not the bigger question. The bigger question to me is, what's the impetus for that disagreement? Is it just a personality conflict between an ECU alum and the person currently leading the board, or is it more of a difference in the opinion on what the strategy is for that university?
And there's a lot of discussion about that. Deborah, he got a $500,000 parachute to leave. That's not a bad departing gift.
Well, that's what happens when you terminate people's contracts or you come to some kind of agreement early on. To me, the bigger issue is the signal that it sends. We've now lost Margaret Spellings, we've lost Carol Folt, now we're losing the chancellor at ECU, and who's going to want to come and be the chancellor?
And by the way, Carol Folt landed very nicely.
She did land very nicely, but then the question is, why wasn't she the right person for North Carolina? So what message is the oldest public university in the entire country sending about its leadership? And I think that message is not a good one.
That is exactly the question, John. I mean, so far as it goes, an observer, and I've tried to be as impartial as I could about this, although I have East Carolina purple and gold leanings, I have to admit that. But I've tried to look at this from an impartial point of view, and insofar as it goes, okay, first it was Spellings, then it was Folt, now it's Staton. The impression that you get from this group of Board of Governors is that anything that went on in the past is bad, it's wrong, and we got to kick over the trash cans and turn things over and change it. Is that an incorrect presumption?
Well, I think that while each individual decision, the Spellings decision, the Carol Folt decision, and the Cecil Staton decision had their own particulars, and the people have different views. I was recently trying to sort my way through all this, and it reminded me of the movie Rashomon, where you see the same event from different points of view. There are some specific grievances, for example, in the Cecil Staton case, where there are people arguing about whether he handled the athletic department correctly. Of course, the allegation was that because there had been an apartment plan that Harry Smith had taken to ECU, the ECU had said no, that made Harry Smith angry. There's discussions about how Cecil Staton got the job and was there a problem with determining what his salary ought to be. So there's all these different specifics. But as Deborah's getting at, set aside the particulars, which are hard to sort out, particularly if it's not your campus or you're close to it, and look at the process problem. Among many other points, I'll simply observe that just months ago, Harry Smith said that he was going to recuse himself from all activities and decisions related to ECU, at which point he clearly intervened to generate what, in this case, is a forced resignation.
It's kind of like Pontius Pilate washing his hands to a certain extent, I think. We've heard crickets from the rest of the Board of Governors on this, with the exception of Stephen Long.
Right.
And Stephen Long came out with a letter that just blasted Harry Smith,
right,
and to some extent Bill Roper for the actions that they took. Crickets from everybody else. Long made an apology, not for what he said publicly at the Board of Governors meeting Friday, made an apology not for what he said, but for the process. But isn't this censorship? Isn't this freedom of speech issue?
Well, people can say anything they want and they can choose not to speak. There must be a culture that they don't want to speak out. I think it goes back before Margaret Spellings. We fired Tom Ross, and whatever you think about him, the Board of Governors elected by the Republicans, and then held a press conference saying it was not about his job performance, he was doing an excellent job. Then we hired, and people thought, oh, he's part of the liberal establishment, which we could argue. Then we hired George W. Bush's Secretary of Education, a conservative woman named Margaret Spellings. Then we ran her out of town because of a lot of things, and according to Mr. Long, Harry Smith was harassing her with emails and constantly badgering her. I know he forced her to hire some people she didn't want to hire when she was president. Then we run out Carol Folt. Now we've run out Cecil Staton. A lot of these things have one thing in common, whether he was chair or not, is Harry Smith. John mentioned the apartment deal. That was extraordinary that the chair of the Board of Governors was writing the chancellor of a member university, in effect a subordinate, suggesting they work together so he could make some money off of a public-private partnership for student housing. We have a big problem.
I don't think he was the chair at that time.
Well, no, he wasn't. He's a member.
No, he was not.
He's a chair.
Right.
But I think there's another issue in here. You talk about responsibility. Look, the people who put this current group of Board of Governors in were our state Senate and our state House. Now, we've heard crickets from them too. So doesn't that evidently say to you that they approve of what the actions this Board of Governors is taking?
Well, I think, when you have a political body, they're going to play politics. I think that's not unusual. I know from the UNC Board of Governors, and I think the state legislature agrees with this, they're really trying to get out of kind of this dark cloud and they want the attention to be more on what the Board of Governors is actually doing as opposed to kind of the backroom.
Well, when you've dug yourself into a hole, stop digging is the great advice.
And what we've now seen, there's this campaign, there have been letters from former members of the Board of Governors, bipartisan, saying your job is to protect this wonderful institution.
Crown jewels.
To attract, everything's a crown jewel, but really, to attract the absolute best people to be our chancellors and to keep your hands out of the cookie jar.
But to my point, John, the Senate named their candidates, elected their candidates, new candidates to the Board of Governors, and all of them but one, Martin Holton, were holdovers from the previous board. Doesn't that tell you they think things are going pretty well?
Well, it certainly would. The alternative scenario would, in other words, if they hadn't reelected most of the members, and if that's not the direction on the other side of the chamber, then that would suggest disaffection. Because that didn't happen, there's either support for what the University Board of Governors has been doing, or deference, one or the other. And deference doesn't quite make sense, Chris, because they are elected by the legislature.
But let me follow up on that, and then I'll let you say what you were going to say. We look at the Board of Governors. We've gone from 32 members down to 28 now. Right. Of that 28 members, only 6 of them are women. Only 3 of them are minorities. Democrats are hard to be found.
Right. One of the African Americans who was a Democrat was not reelected. Was not going to be reelected by the House.
Yeah.
Who had the most experience on the Board of Governors?
Now,
I voted
the common
for
response
Walter
I get from this is, oh yeah, well when the Democrats were running things, they did such and such.
That's actually not true in this case.
That's a pivot. It's a defense.
Well, two things are true. And Deborah was in the House when all this was going on. There was a segment of the board that was reserved for the minority party for years. Yes. The chair of the Board of Governors when the Republicans ran the legislature was Peter Hans, who now runs the community college system, who was a prominent Republican. Imagine these people electing a prominent Democrat to run the board. The other thing is,
I don't think they could find one.
Well, here's the couple quick other points. What's so interesting is this hasn't been covered for so long, and now we're in this crisis. I mean, I think it's good that we're getting all this scrutiny. As was pointed out this past week, 2 of the members of the House leadership work for a member of the Board of Governors. They get paychecks from the member of the Board of Governors, David Lewis and John Bell, who's the House Majority Leader. This is a very insular, inside situation that needs to have a lot more transparency. I noticed Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger said this week he talks to them often. We want the legislature to appoint the best people and let them run the university.
Well, back to Greenville, John, this Board of Governors is also selecting trustees for East Carolina University, and according to the Lewis Steve Long letter, they were threatening trustees that if they didn't stand behind Harry Smith, they weren't going to be renominated. I understand there's a whole slate of new ones that are getting ready to come on here. Let me ask you a question. Is all of this overreaction? Or is there some real fire here? Is it just smoke, or is there some? It seems to me like a lot of people have been drinking Kool-Aid.
Well, there's a lot of different images and analogies in your question, Tom.
Well, you ought to be able to find one answer out of that.
I'm working on it. But what I will simply say is, of course, it is not just a lot of smoke. There is fire. There was a change in how trustees are placed. And it's very noticeable that because of the backlash, because of the pressure, including from Karen Shanahan, who was the chair of the ECU Board of Trustees, saying, hey, you're ignoring the representation question that we already talked about. And so they had to push back and change some of those names at the last minute. That suggests
put 2 more women
that public pressure matters. And I just want to point that out. It has resulted in changes this week.
So I want to go around the horn really quickly here and just ask you very briefly, is anything going to happen as a result of this, Deborah?
I think that there's going to have to be a crisis point. And
you don't think we've hit it yet?
I think we have in certain respects. I think we have for the institution. But I think that the public pressure, as John alluded to, is going to have to really hit them.
So how bad has it got to get? John, is anything going to change?
I think that the main story here, the main actor here is now Bill Roper, who has just come in and really wants, I sense, wants a different process and to turn the burner down on the stove.
Well, the role he played, did he help himself with that?
I think that he was trying to settle the pre-existing matters that had started before he came in.
Sounds like he was following orders. Is anything going to change?
I have a lot of respect for Bill Roper. Remember, he's the interim president of the UNC system, so we'll see how that things.
If I were he, I would not want to.
Well, a lot of people want him there because he's a responsible human, but I think Deborah's onto something. Until we have a crisis, one thing is interesting: the business community now is starting to speak out, who has ignored this crisis for a long time. I think we've got to make some changes.
I understand that there's an organization of a couple of hundred people that are forming to try to get something done. You think anything's going to happen?
Well, I mean, certainly things are going to change when we get the new UNC system president that they're searching for right now. But I think it's important to note that when you get outside of Chapel Hill, when you get outside of Raleigh, people aren't talking about this. This isn't...
UNC what?
Well, they are talking about UNC, but they're more concerned about tuition. They're more concerned about college affordability, about, turning out a prepared workforce. They're not nearly as concerned with who's running things behind the scenes.
All right, I want to switch gears on us right now. Primary elections for the 2020 elections are going to be held early next year. In fact, March 3rd. Already candidates are lining up to run, and we want our panel to discuss some of the more interesting races and faces that will be running. And early as it is, maybe we have some, already have some polling data, early polling data. Elon University released a poll just a week or so ago showing 48% of the voters would choose a generic Democratic candidate for president, whomever it might be, to 36% saying that they would vote for President Trump. The top Democrats favored in that poll were former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders. Deborah Ross, we always try to caution people not to put too much credibility in these early polls. But what do you make of the fact that those polls would vote for almost any Democrat over President Trump?
Well, but only by a small margin.
12 percentage points.
That under for 50%.
Under
that's
50%.
The point she's making.
Under 50%. Yeah. And the Democrats, and remember, Bernie Sanders really isn't a Democrat. The Democrats whose names are out there are the ones that everybody knows. So early, it's about name recognition. It's about how big the margin is. But it is going to be a lifetime between now and November 2020. And the primaries are going to shake out in ways that will...
Really early.
Well, they were early in the last presidential election.
March
Remember,
3rd?
they changed it? They were March 15th. I remember well. And so I think there's a lot of time between now and then. What I think is interesting is that there seems to be more energy now early than there has been in the past.
Well, let's talk
energy on the part of the electorate.
Let's talk about some of that energy. Probably one of the campaigns, the presidential campaign obviously is always going to be something we can talk about. One of the campaigns getting a lot of discussion right now is Senator Thom Tillis's reelection. A lot of people said when he did a flip-flop or belly flop or whatever you want to call it, in saying that he was, first of all, not going to vote for the emergency proclamation of the president, then changed his vote and did, that he put himself in a lot of trouble. Agree or disagree?
I mean, I think it reflects kind of the tricky situation he faces right now. I mean, already there's rumblings kind of below the radar that Republicans may launch a legitimate primary challenge to Senator Tillis. So I think he's facing some of that pressure and wanting to tack back to the right before the March primary. And then when you get to the general election, he's going to have to go back in the other direction.
All right, let's be real honest about this. I hear all of this noise about being primaried. Come on. The guy's been Speaker of the House of North Carolina. He's been a U.S. Senator, was elected very easily, I think, his first time around. Got a lot of name recognition in North Carolina, certainly knows how to raise money. Would a primary challenger really be that much of a threat to him?
Well, you wanted to talk about the truth, and then you asked me the question? I don't know.
Chris.
What I would say about that is that, of course, we have primary challengers against incumbents fairly frequently. Not usually is the incumbent defeated, but sometimes the incumbent is damaged by a particularly spirited or well-financed primary challenge.
But they usually win.
Yes, but in this particular case, there was pretty openly flirtation by Mark Walker, the congressman who heads the Republican Study Committee, arguing that he might consider a primary challenge if Tillis had voted against with the resolution from the House. He didn't. I don't think Mark Meadows or Mark Walker will run. I do think that Garland Tucker, a Raleigh business person, retired, is a possible candidate. I don't think that itself would be particularly damaging to Tillis,
he's not
but
well
we'll
known
see.
statewide. I mean, so far as it goes, the people on the far right aren't going to vote for a Democrat under any circumstances.
No, but a couple of things. First of all, Tillis didn't win easily. It was a very close election to when he was elected to the U.S. Senate. Secondly, that just wasn't a flip-flop. That was one of the odder things we've seen in recent times. It wasn't just that he said, oh, I'm going to vote for this and voted against it. He wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post explaining why this was a terrible idea, and then went to the floor of the Senate and voted the opposite way. That was that was legendary.
I talked to an awful lot of Republicans saying he lost me. I don't know who's running against him, but as a matter of fact, what are the names of some of the Democrats that we know that are probably going to run for this Senate seat?
We already have announced candidate in Erica Smith, a state senator. Deborah, what do you think?
I don't know. It's a long time between now and filing.
Trevor Fuller, who's a Mecklenburg County Commissioner.
Right.
The story there sort of is who's ruled it out in a way. I mean, Anthony Fox, former Transportation Secretary, and Charlotte Mayor apparently is not running. There was a rumor going around Raleigh this past week that Raleigh Mayor Nancy McFarland was approached to run and declined to run. So I think there's a lot of big names that still haven't announced, but they're trying hard.
Andrew, I can see the TV ads now. Tom Tillis was more worried about keeping his job than he was doing his job. Vote Democrat.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, that's a ready-made storyline that's gonna dominate, for the next year. In terms of who's going to run on the Democratic side, I think a lot of people are waiting to see what Senator Jeff Jackson from down in Charlotte is going to do. He's looked at as one of the top candidates, but he's looking at 2020 and 2022. If I'm him, why run against an incumbent when you can go against an open seat?
And Richard Burr is going to have an open seat. There's no question about it. Let's move to some of the other ones. Deborah, it's pretty well understood Roy Cooper is going to be running for re-election. In fact, he's already started his re-election campaign. Yeah. Dan Forrest, Lieutenant Governor, is going to be running against him. Any other names you're hearing so far as Republicans that might be running for governor?
I have not been hearing. It's been much more, other than Dan Forrest, I haven't heard a lot.
I think Pat McCrory will probably come out soon and say he's going to announce his intentions on his show. And then have
and his audience will spike, and then he'll say no. Any other names you're hearing?
No, I think that the only real significant challenger to Dan Forrest would be the former Governor Pat McCrory.
Yeah. All right, so let's move to the lieutenant governors, because this is going to be there's going to be an open seat here. All right, Terry Van Dyne has already announced, Senator Terry Van Dyne, she's running. Cal Cunningham, former legislator, is going to run. Yvonne Holley is going to run for lieutenant governor. Alan Thomas, the Hoke County Commissioner, not the Pitt County, and Bill Toole, all Democrats.
And Chaz Beasley as of last night.
Right.
Ah, okay.
Representative from Charlotte.
Yeah.
From Charlotte.
Right. All right. So far as Republicans are concerned, Renee Elmers has announced her intentions. Anybody else you're hearing?
No, I don't. Has she said that? I think she said she was considering it. Deborah Cochran, who's the mayor of Mount Airy, I think is the only specifically announced Republican candidate in this field. But Jim Puckett, who is a former county commissioner in Mecklenburg, Scott Stone, who's a former state rep in Mecklenburg, are both apparently considering it.
All right.
And I continue to hear rumblings that Mark Johnson, the superintendent of public instruction,
that was where I wanted to go next, because Mark Johnson certainly has had an interesting tenure as 4 years as superintendent of public instruction. That's going to be a contest that's going to be very interesting. We assume he's going to run for re-election if he doesn't move elsewhere. But we've already got 4 people lined up on this. Keith Sutton from Wake County Board of Education, Mike Mayer, Assistant Dean of Education at NC State, James Barrett, Chapel Hill Carrboro School, Jen Mangum, who ran against Phil Berger last year. Any others you're hearing there?
I have heard several other people considering it, but I don't think that they're likely, so I won't mention them. But I will say those candidates all, of course, are coming from some connection to education. I think that finding candidates to run who are not directly connected to education is unlikely. Got
just a little bit of time left, but I want to hit on the Supreme Court situation, because with the Supreme Court Chief Justice leaving, Sherry Beasley was appointed, has to run again in 2020.
Right.
Already lining up some opponents there, Paul Newby for one.
Which creates another vacancy. So we're likely to have 3 Supreme Court races in 2020.
And names for that, I'm hearing for Democrats, Mark Davis, who was just appointed.
He'll run for that seat. And then Lucy Inman from the Court of Appeals has said that she will run. We've heard Phil Berger Jr. will run. We've heard that Tamara Beringer will run, former state senator. And then there are some Republican women on the Court of Appeals who we've heard might want to move up.
Well, and we're going to have all kinds of openings on the Court of Appeals because of these appointments and so forth like that. And the legislature has just restored this to 15 seats. Wow. Going to be an interesting time. We'll be talking about a lot between now and March 3rd, no question. But right now we want to talk about what you're going to tell us that we don't know. Chris Fitzsimon, I'm going to start with you.
Well, we talk a lot on the show about whether or not the North Carolina General Assembly is going to approve Medicaid expansion. The state of Kansas, the State House of Kansas with a super Republican majority passed it this week.
Andrew, quickly, tell us something we don't know.
Well, all we're talking about in Charlotte is 9th Congressional District. It's a very fractious primary. We'll see if they can come back together.
Deborah, tell us something we don't know.
We're about to have bipartisan consensus on improving sexual assault laws, and it is long overdue.
And it's a topic we're going to be taking up in a few weeks. John, tell us something we don't know.
Apples to apples comparison. Governor Cooper wants to increase spending 5.6%. The legislature is pitching 3.5%.
Wow. And I've got one real quick. Yesterday, my wife and I went to see Art in Bloom at our new North Carolina Museum of Art. It is fabulous.
We're going to.
Please go. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter, give your feedback, and read my weekly column. Visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And next week, we've got a special program for you. Agriculture is an $87 billion economic contributor. It's 17% of our employment. We've got a panel devoted entirely to agriculture. Until that time, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
North Carolinians pay for health insurance for people in 37 other states, yet 300,000 of our citizens have no affordable health insurance options. Let's find a North Carolina solution for covering the uninsured. Visit careforcarolina.com.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.